Episode 8, Power and Belief, How Politics Shaped the Reformation and How It Spread, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. So last episode we focused on Luther's ideas, things like salvation by faith alone, the authority of Scripture, and Luther's criticism of indulgences. But this episode feels different already. This isn't just about beliefs. It's about why those beliefs actually survive in some places and spread into entirely new churches across Europe.
That's exactly right, Miles. Ideas alone don't change history. They need the right political conditions to survive. And in Germany, those conditions were unusually favorable.
So this really comes down to the political situation in the Holy Roman Empire.
Yes. And to understand that, we need to be very clear. The Holy Roman Empire was not a centralized state like France or Spain was becoming. It was a patchwork of hundreds of territories, duchies, principalities, bishoprics, and free imperial cities, each ruled by princes, bishops, or city governments with a great deal of local independence.
So the emperor isn't really in full control.
Not even close. Charles V had great prestige, and on paper he was the emperor, but in practice he depended on cooperation from territorial rulers who guarded their privileges very closely. He couldn't just send officials into every German territory and expect instant obedience.
And that's why Luther survives after the Diet of Worms.
Exactly. As we covered last episode, Luther is condemned by the emperor after refusing to recant. But what matters here is enforcement, and in the Holy Roman Empire, enforcement depends on local rulers, and some of them refuse.
Like Frederick the Wise.
Yes. Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony, protects Luther by arranging for him to be hidden at Wartburg Castle. That protection is decisive. Without Frederick, Luther is very likely arrested and executed, and the Reformation may remain a short-lived protest instead of becoming a continental movement.
So the Reformation survives because the emperor can't enforce his own law.
That's the core idea. Political fragmentation creates space for religious change.
But why do princes support Luther in the first place?
Several reasons. Some genuinely agree with his religious ideas, but many are also thinking politically. Supporting Luther allows them to challenge papal taxation, reject outside interference from Rome, and push back against imperial pressure from Charles V.
So it's a power move.
Very much so. It also allows them to seize church lands, monasteries, shrines, and other ecclesiastical wealth, and to bring clergy and church institutions under territorial control. In other words, reform can make a ruler stronger inside his own lands.
So they're gaining power and money.
Yes, and control. Religion becomes something tied to political authority.
Is that what leads to rulers deciding the religion of their territory?
Exactly. Over time, this develops into the idea that each ruler determines the religion of their land.
That's a huge shift from a unified Catholic Church.
And from the perspective of ordinary people, it's incredibly destabilizing. Religion had been a shared, universal system, and now it depends on where you live.
So your faith could literally change if you moved.
Yes, and that creates uncertainty, confusion, and sometimes conflict.
Is that where the German Peasants' War fits in?
It does. Between 1524 and 1525, peasants revolt across parts of the German lands. They draw on reform language and on long-standing economic grievances, things like rents, feudal dues, labor obligations, and access to common lands, to justify demands for social and economic change.
So they're taking Luther's ideas further.
In some ways, yes. They argue for equality and justice, but Luther rejects their movement.
Why?
Because he wants religious reform, not social revolution. When the revolt turns violent, he supports the princes.
And the princes crush the revolt.
Brutally. Tens of thousands are killed as noble forces crush the uprising. And the outcome reinforces princely authority, because it makes clear that Luther's movement will be tied to territorial rulers, not to popular social revolution from below.
So instead of weakening the system, the Reformation actually strengthens rulers.
In many ways, yes. Protestant princes formalized that power by organizing together, most notably in the Schmalkaldic League, founded in 1531 to defend Lutheran territories.
So religion is turning into a political alliance.
Exactly. And Charles V does try to break it. He defeats the League in the Schmalkaldic War in the 1540s. But even with a military victory, he can't impose lasting religious unity.
Because of everything else he's dealing with.
Right, the Habsburg-Valois Wars over Italy and the Ottoman advance under Suleiman the Magnificent after Mohawks in 1526. He's stretched thin, and the empire is too decentralized to enforce one settlement everywhere.
So what happens instead?
A political compromise. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 recognizes Lutheranism and establishes that each ruler determines the religion of his territory, cuius regio, eius religio.
So the division becomes official.
Exactly. Not because everyone agrees, but because the political system makes uniformity impossible.
Okay, so that explains Germany. But how do these ideas spread beyond German-speaking lands?
Once reform ideas begin circulating, they don't stay unified. They evolve into different forms depending on local conditions, different city governments, different rulers, different social groups, and different understandings of what a truly reformed church should look like.
So Protestantism isn't just one thing.
Not at all. And the textbook emphasizes that this diversity is one of the defining features of the Reformation beyond Germany. Different regions adopt and adapt reform ideas in ways that fit their own social and political contexts.
So it's not just spreading, it's changing as it spreads.
And one of the most important new directions that comes out of that process is associated with John Calvin.
So where does Calvin fit in?
John Calvin represents the next stage. He's a French reformer, but he becomes most closely associated with Geneva. His ideas are more systematic, especially his belief in predestination, that God has already determined who will be saved and who will be damned.
That feels like a really strict system.
It is, but it's also very structured. Calvin outlines his ideas in the Institutes of the Christian Religion, first published in the 1530s and expanded later, and he helps build a disciplined religious community in Geneva where church and civic authorities work closely together.
So Geneva becomes important.
Very important. When I take students to Geneva, what stands out is how deliberately organized the city feels, almost like religion has been built into the structure of everyday life. That's not accidental. It reflects Calvin's influence.
So people go there to learn this system?
Exactly. Geneva becomes a training center. Religious refugees, preachers, and reform-minded scholars come there, study Calvinist theology and church organization, and then return home to spread those ideas in places like France, the Netherlands, and Scotland.
So this is spreading through networks of people.
Yes, and we should add another layer here. Many of the people spreading these ideas are educated elites, preachers, scholars, lawyers, printers, and urban leaders. Cities play a major role because they have higher literacy rates, universities, printing presses, and stronger communication networks than the countryside.
So this is especially an urban movement.
In many places, yes. Urban populations are more likely to read pamphlets, discuss ideas, and engage with reform. That's one reason Calvinism spreads effectively in cities.
Why Calvinism specifically?
Because of its emphasis on discipline, order, and moral behavior. In a growing urban environment shaped by trade, migration, and social tension, those values can be very appealing. Calvinism offers a clear moral structure and a tightly organized community in a rapidly changing world.
So it fits the needs of those communities.
Exactly.
And Calvinism spreads even further than Lutheranism in some cases. It reaches places like the Netherlands and Scotland, not just Switzerland and France. Because it travels effectively through international urban networks and because it can appeal to groups resisting powerful monarchies.
So it's more international.
In many ways, yes. It travels along trade routes, intellectual networks, and political alliances.
So people start thinking for themselves about religion.
Exactly. And that can lead to different interpretations, which is why Protestantism becomes so diverse.
So we've got different versions of Protestantism spreading across Europe. But is it always driven by reformers like Calvin, or do rulers sometimes take the lead themselves? Because that makes me think, what about England? I feel like Henry VIII is a big missing piece here.
He is, and he shows how political motives can drive reform even more clearly than in Germany. Henry VIII breaks from the Catholic Church in the 1530s, not because of theology like Luther, but because he wants an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine had only produced a surviving daughter, Mary, and Henry was deeply concerned about securing a male heir to stabilize the Tudor dynasty, and avoid the kind of succession conflicts England had experienced during the Wars of the Roses.
And the Pope won't grant it.
Right, and the situation is even more complicated than that. Catherine of Aragon is the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who at this moment has significant influence over the papacy, especially after imperial troops sack Rome in 1527. The Pope is in no position to offend Charles, so he delays and ultimately refuses Henry's request for an annulment. So Henry responds by passing the Act of Supremacy in 1534, which makes him the head of the Church of England.
So that's purely political.
At first, yes, but it still has major religious consequences. English churches separate from Rome, monasteries are dissolved, and over time Protestant ideas begin to influence English religion.
So even when it starts politically, it still changes people's religious lives.
Exactly.
But does Protestantism actually last in England, or does it change after Henry?
That's the key question. And this is where the textbook section, Upholding Protestantism in England, comes in. After Henry VIII dies in 1547, his son Edward VI rules, and under his advisors, England becomes more clearly Protestant. Church services shift toward English, and doctrine becomes more influenced by Reform ideas.
So that's when England really starts to look Protestant.
Yes, but it doesn't last immediately. Edward dies young, and his half-sister Mary I, who is a committed Catholic, comes to the throne.
That's Bloody Mary, right?
Yes. Mary attempts to restore Catholicism and persecutes Protestants, executing several hundred of them. That creates fear, but it also strengthens Protestant identity among survivors.
So England swings back to Catholicism for a bit.
Exactly, but then Mary dies, and Elizabeth I comes to power in 1558. Elizabeth establishes what historians call the Elizabethan settlement.
What does that mean?
It's a compromise. England remains officially Protestant, with the monarch as head of the Church of England, but some traditional practices are retained to avoid extreme conflict. And Elizabeth has to defend that settlement. In 1588, Philip II of Spain sends the Spanish Armada against England, partly as a Catholic challenge to Protestant England.
So this is bigger than England's internal politics now.
Much bigger. The Armada is tied to the broader religious and political struggle in Europe. Its defeat does not end conflict with Spain, but it does help secure Protestant rule in England under Elizabeth.
So the Protestant movement in England was not as radical as Calvinism, but not Catholic either.
Right. It creates a kind of middle ground, and that stability, along with Elizabeth's survival and the defeat of the Armada, is what allows Protestantism to take lasting root in England.
So unlike Germany, where princes decide, in England it's really the monarch driving religion over time.
Exactly, and that reinforces the broader pattern we've been seeing. Political authority determines religious outcomes.
Okay, now where do these ideas spread geographically?
In Scandinavia, rulers adopt Lutheranism and establish state churches, especially in Denmark, Norway under Christian III and in Sweden under Gustavus Vasa. In France, Calvinism spreads among groups known as Huguenots, especially among urban populations and some nobles.
What about Eastern Europe?
That's another important piece. In places like Poland, Lithuania, and Hungary, Protestant ideas spread among the nobility, who often want greater independence from both the Catholic Church and central monarchies.
So again, elites are key.
Yes, but Eastern Europe remains more religiously mixed. Lutheran, Calvinist, and Catholic communities coexist, and rulers are often more tolerant because they need cooperation from powerful nobles.
And that creates a very different religious environment, less uniform, but sometimes more flexible than in Western Europe.
So again, rulers play a big role.
Yes, political adoption is critical. Protestantism spreads most successfully where rulers support it.
So it's the same pattern as Germany.
Exactly. Ideas plus political support equals lasting change.
And from a cultural perspective, this creates very different religious environments across Europe. Some regions emphasize discipline and moral order, like Calvinist areas. Others follow Lutheran traditions. Others remain Catholic.
So Europe becomes religiously divided.
Yes, and that division shapes people's identities, communities, and daily lives.
This is starting to come together. The Reformation isn't just spreading randomly. It follows political structures and communication networks.
That's exactly right.
Let me try to sum this up. The Reformation survives in Germany because the Holy Roman Empire is politically fragmented, so rulers like Frederick the Wise can protect Luther and resist the emperor. Charles V wants to stop the movement, but he's tied down by wars against the Valois rulers of France and by Ottoman expansion under Suleiman the Magnificent. Then reform spreads beyond German-speaking lands because leaders like Calvin and Geneva develop new and influential versions of Protestantism, and networks of reformers, rulers, and urban communities help those ideas take root and spread.
That's a strong synthesis, Miles.
Very clear.
In Episode 9, we'll explore the Catholic Church's response to the Reformation and the waves of religious violence that followed across Europe. Thanks for listening to the Once and Future Present, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions.
Stay curious and think.